All right, I'm not sure if I can do a full screen. Okay, there it is.
It looks great.
Okay, this talk is going to be about the history of education in the USA and how it's been affected by the humanist worldview and how we can interact with others caught up in the lies of the world. And I want to everybody understand that Christians don't deny science. They deny bad science. It's not religion versus science, but good science versus bad science. And Christians don't deny the evidence. They deny the atheist interpretation of the evidence. And evidence is key, is what I believe. And you've got to understand what evidence is. And evidence is what we can observe or try to put together what happened in the past. And we're going to go through a little history of the public schools. And the first public school was started on the Massachusetts Old Satan Deluder Act of 1647. And this established the first public school system. And since the Puritans believed that children were born with the original sin, they had to be raised in an atmosphere of fear and strict discipline, hard work, and a knowledge of the Bible to delude Satan. The Bible is the Americans' first school textbook. So they understood that Satan doesn't want us to be in the Bible, and the Church of England tried to teach people in Latin, and people revolted against it. Unfortunately, we had people that translated it into the English language, like William Tyndale. And the old deluder, he's still trying to get into the education system, and he always will. But they started it with the right thing, and in 5 different states changed that at the time. Harvard University was founded in 1836 with the intention of establishing a school to train Christian ministers in accordance with the vision of Harvard's rules and precepts adopted in 1646, stated original spelling and scripture references retained. Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed toward to consider well the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life. John 17:3, and therefore to lay Christ at the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning, and seeing the Lord only giveth wisdom. Let everyone seriously set himself by prayer in secret to seek it of him. Everyone shall so exercise his life in reading the scriptures twice a day that he shall be ready to give an account of his proficiency therein, both in the theological observation of language and logic, and in practical and spiritual truth, as his tutor shall require according to his ability, seeing the entrance of the word, given light, and given understanding to the simple. Psalms 119, 130. So Harvard was started as a Christian school. It slowly moved away, and I believe the Christians started Yale, and that slowly moved away. They started Princeton and a few other of the Ivy League schools, and it slowly moved away from the space. And now when Christians start schools, atheists just totally try to discredit them. And but understand that our schools were started on a Christian foundation. Here's a quote from John Quincy Adams. The highest glory of the American Revolution was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity. And the British thought that the American Revolution was, they called it the Presbyterian Ministers' Revolution, and I think it might have been properly entitled the Puritan and Presbyterian and all the Protestant ministers' revolution, but maybe they didn't like the Presbyterians. And it really was the backbone of the revolution was the Protestant ministers. And they were the ones that really were the driving force. And they found from the Constitution, they have traced the Constitution to 40% of it being directly written from sermons of pastors at the time. And it was basically a civilian government, but it's based on principles of Christianity. John Adams says our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. And religious, he means Christian. It was wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Patrick Henry, it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians, not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. And another quote from Patrick Henry, the Bible is a book worth more than all the other books ever printed. And they took this all very seriously. So the big change in schools, it started with the Butler Act in 1925, and Tennessee passed the following law called the Butler Act. And it says, it shall be unlawful for any teacher to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order or animals. And this was adopted by at least 5 other states. And it really didn't deny saying evolution of animals. It just said that we didn't descend from apes or any other lower animals. And the ACLU hated this law at the time, and they advertised to try to find a city that would find a teacher that violated this law, and they would make it a test case, and we're going to try to bring it to the Supreme Court to have it outlawed. And this is what started with the Scopes monkey trials, what we know. And Dayton, Tennessee was a small town in Tennessee, and they had been had a population of 3,000, and by 1925 it had gotten down to 1,000, and they lost an important industry, and they thought they could put themselves on the map if they would have this trial. So they started the trial. They got a teacher to volunteer, who was John Scopes. He was actually a football coach and a math teacher, but he substituted 2 weeks at the end of the year for a biology teacher, and they got him to say that he taught biology. He didn't really teach biology. They might have read something like this. That was a very evolutionary-based book. It was a racist book, and thought that black people were inferior and different racist things. But he went ahead and agreed, and the prosecution got William Jennings Bryan. And he was a very famous man. He ran for president 3 times. He was a Democrat, and he was the Secretary of State for a period of time. And he was kind of a oddball Democrat, kind of like Barry Sanders is today. And after World War II, he took it upon himself to preach against social Darwinism, basically. And I don't know if they called it that at the time. This was 7 years after the end of World War II. And he saw it as the cause of people wanting war, and was the cause of World War I. And he also saw it as a cause of laissez-faire capitalism, which is true. And he would go to churches and preach about it. And Clarence Darrow, he was kind of the elite defense attorney at the time, and once he heard William Jennings Bryan was going on, he wanted to go and fight against him. And he was 70 years old, and they wanted H.G. Wells to do it, and he was a science fiction writer, but they took Clarence Darrow, and he was a very antagonistic to the Bible and Christianity. And John Scopes never admitted. I furnished the body that needed to sit in the defendant's chair, and he denied teaching it afterwards, but they coached some, the defense actually coached some students and got them to get on the stand and to testify that they were taught. And it was just a show trial. They're just trying to make publicity, and the town got telegraph and radio and everything set up, and big places for people to eat, and a lot of people came to the town for the trial. And William Jennings Bryan, he said that Darwinian teaching would give children a doctrine that refutes not only their belief in God, but their belief in a Savior and a belief in heaven, and takes from them every moral standard that the Bible gives us. And Clarence Darrow, he held that evolutionary teaching would prove harmless to children, and that morality could be learned outside the Bible. And he was famous for the Leopold murder trial of 1923, and this was kind of the OJ trial at the time. Two young men kidnapped one of their cousins, 14-year-old cousins, and they literally cut them to pieces. And won't go into any more detail about that. And Darrow defended them and got them off of the death penalty and got them life imprisonment. And here was the argument that he had. He claimed that they were influenced by teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher much admired by Hitler. Nietzsche, in turn, derived his philosophy of God and ethics directly from Darwinian principles. He thought Christian morality must be replaced by a new evolutionary ethic, which would turn traditional moral values upside down. Virtues like truthfulness, love, and compassion are actually bad because they interfere with the survival of the fittest, according to Nietzsche. Strength, deceit, cruelty, and cunning are proper Darwinian virtues instead. So he justified, they were taught evolution in college, and said because of that they did this horrible thing. And he tried to justify that, but then he had a different tact when he got to the Scopes murder trial. And evolution attacks God's place as creator and man's special position in creation as the only creature made in the image of God, and also destroys man's concept of the sanctity of life. If man is just an animal, then human life is no more value than animal life. So they had the trial. It went on for 7 days, and they had the students testify, and the defense wanted to put on some scientists, and the prosecution wanted to cross-examine them, and it wasn't automatically, and the judge granted them the right to cross-examine, and Darrow decided to have them submit written statements into the court. And in the appeal process, he had more written statements written. There was actually 180 different proofs for evolution that were submitted, and today we know all of them are not valid. And the defense also called the prosecutor and put him on the stand, which was unusual. And they prosecuted him, and he wanted to make his own statement. And they said, "We'll go ahead and want to put the case to the jury," and we were pleading for a guilty plea. And so they turned it over to the jury, and in about 9 minutes, they found him guilty. So it was a very big defeat for evolutionists, and it was validated the law. The ACLU got it overturned, and nobody agreed to retry it. But it was rewritten, and now everybody who thinks they know about it thinks they know about it from the movie Inherit the Wind. And it was a play first, and it was basically rewriting all of history. The bad guys were the good guys, and the good guys were the bad guys. And they started off with guys look like they're the Ku Klux Klan, and they break into his schoolroom, and there's a lady singing, "Give us that old time religion" off key, and they try to make Christians look like baboons. And Actually, he was never arrested. This never happened. He went in and the prosecutor gave him a court date, who was a friend of his. And just the whole thing, it's ironic that the play movie Inherit the Wind, which exaggerated the misrepresented the victory of humanists at the Scopes trial, accused Bryan and the creationists of causing unnecessary trouble. The title is based on Proverbs 11:29, which says, "He who troubles his own house will inherit the wind." And they're trying to make creationists, trying to push in 1960 for the evolution to be taught in the school and make creationists look like idiots. And they're saying that they caused this great thing. And actually we see today that the house is inheriting the wind of the result of the evolutionists in our country, and the shoe was really on the other foot. History is showing that the evolutionists who have troubled their own house, filling their own school and society with violence and immorality, as we see today. It's not a new idea. Adolf Hitler had it before. Let me control the textbooks and I will control the state. It takes a couple generations, but that's the way it works out, and that's the way the old deluder goes about it. The teaching of evolution versus creationism was spotty until 1958. The Soviet Union had just launched the Sputnik satellite, and the United States was facing a shortage of mathematicians. Fearing that the Soviet Union was beating the United States in the science literacy, President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, a funding bill designed to improve science education. It actually made evolution to be taught, required to be taught in the schools. And what happened as a result, U.S. students' academic achievement still lags that of their peers in many other countries. That's the title of an article, recent article. How do U.S. students compare with their peers throughout the world? Recently released data from International Math and Science Assessments indicate that U.S. students continue to rank around the middle of the pack and behind many other advanced industrial nations. I think we need to get back to old-fashioned teaching, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and not getting into all these silly stories from the great deluder. And it's funny, you gave them an inch and they take a mile. Evil preaches tolerance until it is dominant, and then it tries to silence good. And I talked to a recently I talked to a biology teacher. He said they got a new biology book. He said there was a whole chapter on evolution, which he didn't have a problem, but he said there was hardly a page that didn't mention in the rest of the book that didn't mention evolution. And they don't tolerate anybody questioning, even a teacher questioning evolution. And we know that from history. And so the next part is going to be, Jonathan Wells wrote a book, Icons of Evolution, and his book, he covers some of the things that are taught in college textbooks and have been taught over the years, and just proving that they're wrong, just like the Scopes monkey trial evidence. All these evidence have been proven wrong. So I want to just kind of go over all of them, and not necessarily the way he did. He's not a young earth creationist, but he saw that there was a problem with this. And an icon is a symbol or a picture of something. It comes from the Greek word ikina, meaning to seem or to be like. And I think of an icon, I think of an idol. If you have something, if it represents reality, that's good. But if it represents fiction, it's an idol. And science is a search for the truth. And you got to search for the truth and don't use icons or idols. The different things he covered, the Miller-Urey experiment, we're going to cover each one, the tree of life, homology, Haeckel's embryos, Archaeopteryx, peppered moth, Darwin's finches, four-winged fruit flies, and fossil horses, and humanoid evolution. First is the great Miller-Urey experiments, and they took this device and boiled the water and added all these things and added electricity, and then they caught things, and it wasn't anything close, but it's still taught in schools today, and people still use it as an argument of proving that life can come from non-life. Fatal flaw number one, the experiment had to remove oxygen in order to form organic compounds. Since oxygen destroys them, by removing oxygen, Miller and Urey no longer simulated an early Earth. So without oxygen, you can't have life, but you can't form these things without life. Number two, Earth's early atmosphere had little, if any, ammonia and methane, and their experiment did. The problem for Miller and Urey experiment is that they needed both to make amino acids. In addition to producing amino acids, the experiment also produced an abundance of toxic chemicals, including cyanides and carbon monoxide, that are harmful to amino acids. His experiment did not produce all of the 20 common amino acids used in protein synthesis, and the chief amino acid the experiment did were racemic. 50% were left-handed and 50% right-handed. As a rule, only left-handed amino acids are incorporated into polypeptides during translation. The very forms of energy suggest to have initiated a biogenesis, actually destroyed the amino acids formed in the process. The experimenters built a trap in the apparatus to collect the formed amino acids to prevent that destruction. No such trap exists in the supposed primordial Earth. In 1981, Dr. Philip Yaki said it best: "You must conclude that no valid scientific explanation of life exists at present. Since science has not the vast idea of how life originated on Earth, it would be honest to admit this to the students, to the agencies funding research, and the public, but our high school students are continue to teach our teenagers the Miller-Urey experiment." There's all kinds of evidence. They don't bring in the problems. They don't teach the students to teach to think. They just kind of basically indoctrinate. The second is Darwin's Tree of Life, and this is a recent, that's his actual drawing of the Tree of Life, and it says, "I think," "I wish," maybe. And this is from the New Scientist. Is Darwinian. Darwin was wrong about his tree, cut down the Tree of Life. Here's a quote. According to the New Scientist, "The Tree of Life has turned out to be a figment of our imagination. The problem involves the passing of genes from one organism to another without sexual reproduction. This may occur in bacteria, for example. However, there's nothing here to support the evolution of new kinds of plants or animals, or even microorganisms. And evolutions are not rejecting evolution, as the scientist's article states. Downgrading the Tree of Life doesn't mean that the theory of evolution wrong, just means that more complex than Darwin imagined. It is much more complex, and they don't have any kind of icon or idol to explain it. They don't have anything to explain it. Mutations, but mutations don't cut it. Here's what we believe. We believe it started with different kinds and branched out, and some of them more than others, and just the evidence for Darwin's Tree of Life just isn't there. The next is homology in vertebrate limbs. Homology, they show that similar hands in a human, a cat, a bat, a porpoise, a horse. And it just, if you look at it as an engineer, you can see that they have common function, but they are designed for their each individual function. And it doesn't mean they have a common ancestor, as they teach still today. They also use homology in DNA because they're similar in DNA, but it's still the engineering thing. If they have similar things happening in their body, if they breathe and have lungs, then they're going to be similar, and that's just not the way it is. Homology involves the theory that macroevolutionary relations can be proven by similarity in the anatomy and physiological of different animals. Since Darwin's, homology has been cited in textbook as a major proof for evolution. It is homology that Darwinists rely on to bridge the gaps in the fossil record. It is homology that underlines the diagrams drawn up by Darwinians from Haeckel to the present day, showing how every living thing is related. Ultimately, however, it is homology that has provided the greatest stumbling block to the Darwinian theory, for at the final and most crucial hurdle, homology has fallen. That's Milton R. shattering. There's Haeckel's embryos. Haeckel, he was prosecuted for scientific fraud, and their images are still used in text books years later, and they knew they were fake. They were actually Darwin's idea. He thought that it was probably similar, and interesting thing about Haeckel's embryo drawings and the Roe versus Wade trial of 1973, the Supreme Court, a professor from University of Michigan, brought them to prove we are all fishes as embryos. And it just is totally an idol, and it's not based on reality. Here's some actual pictures compared to the drawing to the actual embryo at the same period, and you can see that none of them are close to what he speculated in his drawing. And unfortunately, the truth isn't being taught to our children today. Haeckel peers, well over 100 years ago, knew his embryo drawings were fraudulent, and this has been widely publicized even by notable evolutionists such as Stephen Jay Gould. As evolutionist Susan Marr has said, thus the public is unaware that its dollars are being squandered on funding of mediocre middle-brow science, or that its children are being intellectually starved as a result of outdated texts and unenlightened teachers. Students are also losing their interest in science, both as a school subject and as a career option. They aren't being taught to critically think. They're being indoctrinated and told to spew back what they are taught. There's no interest because they're not allowed to criticize and think on their own, and that's the problem, I believe, in our schools today and why we're lagging behind. The next is the Archaeopteryx, and they found the Archaeopteryx in the fossil record, and they said, oh, this is the missing link between the dinosaurs and the birds. And Archaeopteryx cannot be regarded as a transitional form. It has a mosaic of characters in common with both, but shows no true transitional structure such as partial scales, partial feathers. It has bones and lungs of a bird. It had these claws, but it shows that it was a bird and not a reptile of any type, and no transitional form. There are no fossil links between it and other reptiles or birds. It stands alone, and true birds have been found which are assigned by evolutionists to an earlier time than Archaeopteryx. It's another icon idol. Pepper moths was a big argument that they still use, and moths in wild are now known to be nocturnal flyers and virtually never remain exposed on a tree trunk, but rather high in the trees on the underside of small branches where birds rarely seem to find them. So this idea, they thought that, hey, with the more pollution coming in, and they actually glued butterflies to trees and showed that lighter trees, the lighter moss would survive in darker times, the darker ones, which is logical, but it just isn't based on reality. And it could have happened and wouldn't have a problem with it, but it just, the evidence isn't there. And actually the numbers of the peppered versus the dark ones haven't changed over the years. So it's another icon idol. Darwin's finches, we talked about this a little bit last month. They just changed too fast. It's evidence of ability to adapt that God gave them to move around the world. Each new discovery of rapid and genetically controlled trait variation like that seen in Darwin's finches would make Darwin cringe. After all, in the end, the new finches species remain fully finch. They didn't change anything. The beaks changed back and forth rapidly. It wasn't over survival of the fittest or anything. It was by design, it appears, for adaptation after the flood. And the finches have been declared an icon idol by me and others. Another big evidence is and they're still holding, the four-winged fruit flies. And this came up fairly recently. German geneticists Christian Nusslein, Vollard, and Eric Weisschan were using a technique called saturation mutagenesis to search for every possible mutation involved in fruit fly development. Their Herculean efforts earned them a Nobel Prize, but they did not turn up a single morphological mutation that would benefit a fly in the world. And what they did through all of these saturation mutagenesis, they did create these four wings, but the extra wings were without muscles. They were just there. It wasn't any new, novel, purposeful information. It just made a different form, and the form was inferior and could not survive or fly outside the lab. And so they got a Nobel Prize out of it. But something I think that might have been going on, and I'm not going to go into it, with bat viruses was saturation mutagenesis, and that's all I'm going to talk about it. The next one is fossil horses. And this was an idea that he saw different horses around the world, and they said that they came from these four-hoofed horses, the small ones, and evolved to bigger ones. But the evolutionary record is actually different. There was bigger ones in the fossil record. It just doesn't match up. It was an icon of an idol, and just wishful thinking, basically. It just didn't happen. Humanoid evolution. Here's pictures, and these drawings would not be allowed as evidence in court. Black and white drawings, grayscale drawings, color drawings, brainwashing. Why are they allowed as evidence in a classroom? And we're going to look at some of the evidence that they had over the years. And Neanderthal man was a very important one, and I had argued with Christians about this, and the Professor von Zeiten lied about the age of the Neanderthal skulls and artifacts for 30 years. A university panel exposed his fraud and resigned in February 2005. Porsche dated the skeleton at 21,300 years, but testing at Oxford showed them to be 3,300 years old. Neanderthal was a humanoid, and actually if you get your DNA test done and you're from Europe and some from Africa, you're going to have some Neanderthal DNA. So here's a boxer, a recent boxer. He's got the same kind of skull. I think there might have been older individuals that lived longer or something like that, and just that their DNA was dispersed and they're no longer like that, but they were humanoids. Java man was held out as human and derived from a few teeth and a skull cap and a leg bone found in Indonesia in 1891 and 1892. The leg bone was found 14 meters, 45 feet from the skull cap, but the two were linked together to make a missing link. They're just wishful thinking. They're trying to put something together as evidence. It's an icon idol. It's not reality. Piltdown Man, almost 40 years later in 1953, Piltdown Man was exposed as a forgery, mainly through the work of Dr. Kenneth Oakley. He showed that the skull was formed a modern human, and a jawbone and teeth were from orangutan. So they try to put two different skulls together. And Piltdown Man, which was all these things were taught in schools. Piltdown Man, again, is a hoax. Nebraska Man was brought up in the Scopes trial, and from one tooth, they put together a picture of a guy and his wife, and showed a whole group of people, and it's all totally speculation, an icon of idol, and let's see, okay, and the tooth turned out to actually be an extinct pig, and total speculation, just wishful thinking, basically, and there's nothing wrong with daydreaming, but it has no place in science. Rampithecus, once regarded as the ancestor of human, is now been realized that it is merely an extinct type of orangutan and ape. And they thought this was ancestor of humans. It just proved to be wrong and was in textbooks. Lucy, she was another great icon idol, and actually when she was in Houston, they brought the bones to Houston and had them in the Museum of Natural Science there, and people were literally falling down on their faces in front of her and weeping. And she was an icon idol if there ever was one. And what happened was the people were on a government grant, and they had 2 weeks before it was going to be running out, and they had the task of proving and finding a missing link. So they were found roughly 1,000 miles apart, scanning more than 500,000 years in evolutionary time, and could they have belonged to the same species? Each of the 4 digs revealed only a partial picture of Lucy, while a 40% complete skeleton has only a fragment of the skull, and it shows on the picture on the right here. You see the brown parts are the real parts and the white part is imagined. They totally restructured her hip, so it looked like she walked upright, but they found out she was a short 3-foot knuckle dragger. She wasn't a humanoid. She wasn't our ancestor, another icon idol. Wells, he graded 10 textbooks in use at the time. How do they treat evolution? Treats it as a theory, describes the issues clearly, discusses possible problems, assumes it to be true, a fact, and completely misleading. He graded all of them D or F, assumed to be true, and taught it as a fact, completely misleading. Here, evolutionists, after all, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. Evolutionists still teach that today, but here's what Jonathan Wells taught. After all, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evidence. It's all about evidence, and just that they teach that, and it's repeated over and over, just as indoctrination. And I think he's absolutely right, and actually I think, here's my quote: after all, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of a creator God. And they think they just use homology and all these different things and saying, oh, biology can't be explained except for evolution. No, look at the evidence and let's see what it really says. Here's another quote from Jonathan Wells: Science follows the evidence wherever it leads, but Darwinianism does not. So the present controversy over evolution is not a war between science and religion. It is primarily a war between Darwinianism and evidence, and the evidence will win, hopefully. And that's the problem in our schools. We don't follow the evidence. And here's another book, Galaxy Formation and Evolution, and contains over 2,383 what I call weasel words. And do you want me to bank your life on this? God is real, and he is the one doing the creating. And you can see they assume, may, predicted, problem, possible, inferred, could, suppose, uncertain, seemed, might, hypothesis, probable, probably, unknown, unlikely. And you see the number of times each one's used. Assume 330 times. That's the way textbooks are. They got to stick with the evidence. And world's leading evolution, Richard Dawkins, shows his compelling evidence for evolution, a cartoon of whales with feet. All just another icon idol is all it is. It's all just imaginary. In Romans 1:22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And that's the problem. They think they know it, and they just don't know, and they're fools. The public has distorted views of science because Christian children are taught in schools that science is a collection of firmly established truths. In fact, science is not a collection of truths. It is a continual exploration of mysteries. Our planet is covered with continents and oceans whose origin we cannot explain. The origin of light is a complete mystery, and so is the existence of human consciousness. They don't talk about these things. They just say, this is a fact, and that's it. The problem is not people being uneducated. The problem is that they are educated just enough to believe what they've been taught and not educated enough to question what they've been taught. We're reaping the win now. Scientific method, here are the facts. What conclusion can we draw from them? And that's what we should do, is look at the evidence and try to see what we could come. Evolutionary method, and this is the way government grants are. Here's the conclusion, and what facts can we find to support it? That's basically the way it is. And another quote from J. Hogan: science today is locked into paradigms, that's assumptions. Every avenue is blocked by beliefs that are wrong, and if you try to get anything published by a journal today, you will run up against a paradigm, and the editors will shut it down. They just aren't open to new ideas. They won't listen to new ideas. They aren't teaching the students how to think. And here's a recent basic tenets of Christian faith. This is Reaping the Whirlwind. The recent article as part of the ongoing release of research about the worldviews of Americans. New data show that just over half now hold a biblically formed view of God, a 22% drop from approximately 30 years ago. The new report reveals that only 51% of Americans consider God to be all-powerful, all-knowing, perfect and just creator of the universe who still rules the world today. In 1991, 73% of Americans believe that to be true. 41% held biblical perspective that Christ lived a sinless life and was fully God and fully man. Over half of all adults, 52%, contend that the Holy Spirit is not a living entity. And so it's just all because we're not being taught this in the schools, and we got to be teaching it in the church. I think what we got to do is everybody we can, and we interact with it, people, use the evidence, talk to them about the evidence, do it in love, and also the law of causality that they have thrown out. The reason they threw it out is because with quantum physics, they can observe some amazing things going on at the quantum level, but they can't figure out how it could be anything. And And so they said it must be uncaused, so the law of causality is no longer valid. Well, I'd say all those things, let's still question what's causing them. And I believe it's Jesus Christ who's in all things and powers all things. And you might not like it, but don't say there isn't a cause. And the law of causality says the most certain and universal of all scientific principles is that of causality, or the law of cause and effect. The implications of this principle have been fought vigorously in the theological and philosophical disciplines, but there is no question of its universal acceptance in the world of experimental science as well as in ordinary experience. Just everything we know has to have a cause. Every event can be traced to one or more events which preceded it, in fact, caused it. We ask, how did this happen? What caused this? Where did this come from? Where did it start? Or incisively, why does this happen? Police investigators on an accident scene, for instance, use the principle of cause and effect every day to determine who was ultimately responsible and how it happened. And that's what I was, an accident reconstructionist. And you use the cause and effect. And you look at the evidence and try to figure out how it got there. And the more you look at evidence, you can see how it got there. When we try to trace the event to its cause or causes, we find that we never seem to reach a stopping point. The cause of the event itself, caused by a prior cause, which affected by a previous cause, and so on back. Eventually, we must face the question of the original cause, the uncaused first cause. And that's what Socrates believed and Plato believed, that there had to be an uncaused and unmoved mover. And when you talk with people, go back to the original cause, what started it all. The Bible says this, and for every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything, in Hebrews 3, verse 4. And that's the ultimate truth, that God is the first cause, and that is the law of causality. And they want to throw that out because it disproves Darwin, because lesser life couldn't have caused greater life. But they don't understand that when I say a simple cell is much lesser than a human, they're like, how can you say that? When I argue with the evolutionists, and I'm like, how can you not say that? But another is Psalm 84, verse 8. Take notice, O senseless among the people, O fools, that when will you be wise? He who affects the ear, can he not hear? He who formed the eye, can he not see? He has the ability, he has the knowledge, he has infinite ability to hear, he has infinite ability to see. And that could cause us with the ability to hear and see. Richard Dawkins says it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. That's the idea they have. And when we deal with people, you got to understand that. I have that problem when I deal with Hindus. They think they're further reincarnated and we're lesser reincarnated, and we're not nearly intelligent as they are. And so with the evolutionists, they have the same problem and look down at us, but I say, let's look at the evidence. Let us reason together. Isaiah 1:18, come let reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins were as scarlet, they shall become white as snow. And Thomas Paine said, to argue with a person who renounced the use of reason is like administering medicine to the dead. It's true. We got to stick with the evidence. We got to stick with logic and reason, and we got to teach our young people how to think. Here's some lies regurgitated from evolutionists. They say evolution is a fact. You don't understand evolution. They say you need to take a class in evolution, and evolution has mountains of evidence. I'm like, let's start with one piece of evidence and talk about it. And they just say, no, we have mountains of evidence. It's funny, creationists deny evolutions, but they're fine with gravity. We don't deny gravity. We observe gravity, but we want to look at the evidence of what causes gravity. and we want to look at the evidence, what causes what we see in life. Come up with a better alternative theory to evolution and collect your Nobel Prize. That's something I've heard dozens of times, and the truth is they won't let you near any kind of journal to publish anything that isn't with their paradigm, and just that's totally silly for them to say that. And I guess all the scientists that believe in evolution are wrong. Well, they might be. That is argument from authority when you say all scientists believe in evolution. We got to look at the evidence and argue the evidence. Robert Jastrow, founder and former director of the Goddard Institute of Space Studies at NASA, wrote, "The universe and everything that has happened in it since the beginning of time has a grand effect without a known cause. An effect without a known cause? That is not the world of science. It is a world of witchcraft, a wild event, and the whims of demons, a medieval world that science has tried to banish. As scientists, what are we to make of this picture? I do not know. I would only like to present the evidence for the statement that the universe and man himself originated in a moment when time began." He doesn't try to speculate. He doesn't try to rule out a God. Well, science today, all they do is try to rule out anything but materialistic God, materialistic assumptions, and rule out a creator God. And this is the way they look at scientists. I have a PhD in astrophysics. I'm published in multiple peer-reviewed scientific journals. My research in sunspot activity has, do you believe in evolution? No, you don't believe in science. Since when did the idea of evolution evolve into science? They try to do it. I think it's what's ruining science. They're not teaching people to think. We teach people how to think critically and examine evidence, accept evolution. We will tell them what to think and don't ask embarrassing questions. So science, I think all of them do that. And Ben Carson says we got to stop progressing from trying to drive God out of the country of our land as they drive him out. Look at the direction we're going. It's a downward spiral. We're reaping the wind, inheriting the wind of just what's happening in our schools. And they're doing it in the courts. They've done a lot in the courts. They got prayer out of the schools in the courts. They couldn't have done it at the federal level, and I don't have a problem with local school districts doing it and maybe states doing it, but the federal constitution says they can't regulate religion, and they started it with the banning school prayer, and now the ACLU and the Freedom from Religion group, they're suing schools, and they don't want anything to be in schools, and schools will face a big lawsuit even if they're allowed under state law to teach Bible or whatever. They don't dare to, because they're going to be faced with a huge lawsuit from the Freedom from Religion group. And here's a little humor finally. Any critical thinking that leads to a conclusion or starts down a logical path would be constructed to support a religion is unconstitutional and not admissible in this or any other state-funded institution. Yes, evolution has finally been confirmed. No, I already have printed the notices printed up. No questions critical of evolution allowed within 500 feet of the building. They're going to try to get the courts to do their things. They do it with gay marriage. They did it with Roe versus Wade. They try to get the court to do these things and claim their constitution. Our country was never intended to do that. That's just part of the dark agenda. The big problem is the devil wants you to pay attention to your feelings. Jesus wants you to pay attention to his truth. It's all about having the truth from the Bible and having that as your basic foundation. And that's what our goal is at MIOS, and that's what we have to do. Whatever doors God opens, do what we can and talk to people and reason to them from the evidence, and Another thing, this is a little humor. If you believe in atheistic evolution, you have no logical reason to claim that COVID-19 wiping out the weak is a bad thing. That's true. And so it's a big problem. And they'll never say that. They worship government, and that's the problem when you kick God out. They worship government, and they're going to trust government to fix their problems, and that's what's happening today. And I don't know what this virus is all about, but I know God's in control, and we can trust him. Let's see. Those who are not governed by God will be ruled by tyrants. So, let's see. Okay. Oh. Let me see. I'm gonna. I don't see where